Okay, so we're diving into something today that's like totally changed how we think about things like travel, finding services,
Mhm.
even ownership. You know, the sharing economy.
Right.
We all know the big names like Airbnb, Uber, all that. But today we're going deeper, going beyond the buzzwords, right?
Yeah.
Doing a deep dive into a 2016 research paper. And it's from Ecological Economics. It's called, get this, the sharing economy, a pathway to sustainability or a nightmarish form of neoliberal capitalism.
Catchy title, catchy title. Gets right to the heart of it,
It really does.
Because the sharing economy, it's painted in such different lights depending on, well, who's doing the talking.
Yeah, it's like everyone's spinning it, trying to
Yeah,
make it fit with what they already believe.
exactly. And the paper, it calls this framing, how different people and groups, tech companies, activists, even academics, they present the sharing economy, well, to serve their own interests.
So it's not really about whether the sharing economy is good or bad in itself.
Yeah.
It's more about like the why, why are they presenting it this way and who
Yeah.
benefits?
You got it. Now, the paper, it digs into three main arguments, ways people frame the sharing economy positively. The first one, economic opportunity.
Right, right. That whole be your own boss thing.
Yeah.
Like turn your car into a taxi with Uber, rent out your spare room on Airbnb, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and the paper specifically talks about those platforms, Airbnb, Uber, but also things like TaskRabbit and JustPark.
Yeah,
So on the surface, it sounds pretty good, right?
yeah.
Who wouldn't want to make some extra cash, put their stuff to work? But, and this is important, the paper, it asks opportunity for whom?
Because yeah, not everyone's starting from the same place, are they? Like I can't exactly list my apartment on Airbnb if I'm renting, right?
Exactly. That's the thing, this whole level playing field idea. It ignores that, some people are already ahead. Someone who owns their home, they're in a way better spot to benefit than someone who's renting and struggling to pay the bills, right?
It's like the people who are already doing well, they get this head start in this new economy, this sharing economy. So yeah, maybe it creates opportunities for some, but it might actually make the gap between the haves and have-nots even bigger.
Exactly. And that leads into the second argument for the sharing economy, sustainability. The idea being that, when you access goods and services instead of owning them, it leads to less consumption, less waste.
Okay, I can see that. Less stuff, smaller environmental footprint. It sounds good. But, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here, isn't that assuming people actually downsize? Like, what if I sold my car because now I'm all about Uber? Is that really better for the environment?
You've hit on a very important point. And the paper actually argues that just because consumption patterns are shifting, from owning to accessing, doesn't automatically mean it's good for the environment.
So it's more complicated than just saying sharing is caring when it comes to the planet.
Right, exactly. It's about the overall impact, not just
Okay.
those individual choices, right?
Right.
Now, the third argument, it's a big one, decentralized power.
Okay, so that's about taking power from the big corporations and giving it back to the people.
Exactly.
Like that maker movement, people creating their own stuff, sharing it, not relying on big companies.
Exactly. The paper talks about that. Also, peer to peer finance, cutting out the banks, open source knowledge sharing, people sharing knowledge freely, even things like co housing, community currencies.
So housing, community currencies. I think we might need to explain those for some of our listeners.
Yeah, you're right. Co housing, it's basically a bunch of people choosing to share resources, living spaces, like
Yeah.
in an intentional community. So they might share gardens, tools, maybe even childcare.
Like a really, really close-knit neighborhood, but with shared values working together.
Exactly. And community currencies, they're like alternative forms of money
Yeah.
created and used within a specific community to, boost the local economy and bring people together.
So instead of just using regular money, they make their own systems to help each other out.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really interesting how these ideas challenge the traditional economic models, the ones with all the power at the top.
Yeah, absolutely. But even with these examples, and they seem empowering, right? We have to be critical of this decentralized power argument.
Because even though the internet connects everyone, it's not necessarily a level playing field, is it?
You got it. And the paper brings up a good point. Can these power imbalances and inequalities, can they be replicated online, even made worse? Just because something is community-based or tech-driven doesn't mean it's automatically fair, right?
So it sounds amazing, right? This decentralized, community-powered sharing economy. But like you're saying, the reality is probably more complicated. And that's where the criticisms come in.
You got it. You're catching on. And some of these criticisms, they really challenge those positive spins, the opportunity, the sustainability, all that.
Okay, yeah, I'm ready to hear the other side, the downsides we should be aware of.
Well, the paper, it brings up three main concerns. The first one, unregulated marketplaces.
Ah, okay, so like the Wild West of the internet,
Yeah.
platforms doing their own thing, no rules, no one watching over them like traditional businesses.
Exactly. Exactly. And that brings up some worries, right? Like about safety for both the people using the platforms and the people working for them.
Yeah, because it's one thing to borrow like a cup of sugar from your neighbor. That's different from letting a stranger crash at your place, right?
Hmm.
Or trusting someone you don't know to drive you around.
Totally. And this lack of regulation, it also brings up concerns about fairness. Like, think about hotels and taxi companies. They've got all these rules to follow, right? Which often makes them more expensive. But platforms like Airbnb, Uber, they can sometimes bypass those rules, so they might have an advantage that's not really fair to those other businesses.
It's like they're playing a different game with different rules, and the businesses that have been playing by the book all along, they're at a disadvantage.
Exactly. And that actually connects to the second big criticism, reinforcing neoliberalism.
Okay, before we go there, can we like define neoliberalism?
Yeah.
I feel like it's one of those words people throw around, but I'm not always sure what it actually means.
Yeah, good point. It can be a loaded term. Basically, it's an economic philosophy, right? It's all
Yeah.
about free markets, deregulation, minimal government intervention.
So less government, more individual responsibility, competition in the market, that kind of thing.
Right, exactly. And the critics, they argue that the sharing economy, it basically takes those neoliberal ideas and puts them on steroids, with technology.
Yeah.
So you end up with this system where workers might not have the same protection, like benefits or job security, and it could actually make inequality worse.
Because in this gig economy, everyone's always hustling for the next gig. It's not like a regular job with a steady paycheck and benefits and all that.
Exactly. And without those safeguards, those regulations, the sharing economy could end up hurting the most vulnerable workers.
So instead of this more equitable future, we end up with the same problems, maybe even worse.
That's the worry. And it's not just about the money, it's about the impact on communities, how we relate to each other.
What do you mean?
Well, if everything's a transaction, if we're just service providers to each other, what does that do to our sense of community?
Oh, that's interesting. Like, if my only interaction with my neighbor is paying them to mow my lawn through an app, it's not the same as, like, borrowing something or helping them out with groceries.
Exactly. It becomes impersonal. And that leads us to the third major criticism, the incoherence of the sharing economy.
Incoherence. So we're saying the sharing economy, it's not even well defined.
Yeah, in a way. The paper points out that it's actually really hard to define. Like, what really counts as sharing in this context? Is it actually about sharing, or is it just consuming, but with a different name?
I see what you mean. It's like borrowing a drill from your neighbor. That feels different from, paying to stay at a stranger's place on Airbnb. But they're both lumped together as sharing economy.
Exactly, and that makes it tough, right? It's hard to regulate something when you can't even clearly define it. And it's hard to really understand the impact. Even the paper itself, it struggles with this, where's the line between sharing, renting, and just buying into a new system?
It's almost like the meaning's gotten lost. Like sharing economy is this big umbrella term. It covers everything from, like you said, borrowing from a neighbor, all the way to these huge companies making money off gig workers.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to look beyond the surface. What are the values underneath? Who holds the power in these systems?
So where do we go from here? I mean, the sharing economy, it's not all good, it's not all bad. So how do we figure this out?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting, I think. The paper, it actually says we need to separate two things. The sharing economy, as we often see it now, which is really platform driven, focused on profits, and then something else, a sharing society.
Okay, interesting. What's the difference?
A sharing society, it's all about collaboration, genuinely helping each other out. It's less about individual transactions, more about like communities pooling their resources, working together for a shared goal.
So it's less about finding the cheapest Airbnb,
Yeah.
right? And more about, like you said, sharing what we have so everyone benefits.
Exactly. It's about shifting our values, moving away from just me, and profits towards thinking about the well being of the whole community, taking responsibility for each other.
That makes sense. But how do we actually get there? How do we go from this kind of messy system where some people are being taken advantage of to a true sharing society?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it takes everyone working together, I think. Governments, they need to step in, make sure there are fair rules, safety nets for people who need them. Businesses, they have to think about ethics, treat their workers fairly. And us, as individuals, we have to be smart consumers. Think about what we're supporting with our choices.
Be critical. Ask the tough questions. Don't just accept what we're told, right?
Exactly. And be willing to have those tough conversations about power, fairness, the kind of future we want.
Because the sharing economy, it's here to stay, right?
Right.
It's up to us to shape it.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has been, wow, really eye-opening. Big thanks to our expert for guiding us through all of this. It's complicated stuff.
Happy to be here. Really enjoyed it.
And to everyone listening, we want to hear from you. How has the sharing economy impacted your life? What excites you about it? What worries you? Let's keep this conversation going. Head over to our social media, share your thoughts, and until next time, thanks for listening.